Guys, delighted I am to welcome back to the podcast the one and only Julie Kelly. You know Julie Kelly. She's the investigative writer for American Greatness. She's also the author of a book that you must get. It's called January 6th, How Democrats Used the Capitol Protest to Launch a War on Terror Against the Political Right. Hey, Julie, thanks for joining me. I thought we have two segments, and I wanted in the first one to focus on the Whitmer trial. I just learned from you that the Whitmer trial is postponed for a couple of days because somebody apparently has COVID. Do we know who?
We don't know who. I contacted one of the defense attorneys, and of course, no one is saying anything who this person is. It's a little strange. I live in Illinois, so we're right next to each other. And I just checked. The COVID cases in Michigan are basically non-existent. That doesn't mean that somebody doesn't have it. But it is suspicious because of what's happening in this trial, which is basically the FBI, as much as the 4 federal defendants, are on trial, accused of entrapping these men using at least a dozen undercover agents and informants to concoct this scheme to lure these defendants into it. And then that resulted in their arrests October 7th, 2020, just in time for the presidential election in a key swing state when early voting was underway, created lots of negative headlines for Donald Trump, accusing these alleged militiamen of taking their cues from the president. So everything about this is very suspect, and this latest claim that somebody has COVID is just yet another odd wrinkle.
Now, you have this judge, this fellow named Jonker, and it appears like at the beginning he was reluctant to let the defense make this entrapment case, or at least make it up front. And then he changed his mind and he said, yes, guys, this is key to your defense. You can go right ahead. What caused him to make that switch?
So you're right. So his initial order was that the FBI entrapment case, which the defense attorneys have really been building in a flurry of motions really since last summer, that he did not want the FBI entrapment defense to be presented until the government presented its full case, all of its witnesses, which would really be a couple of weeks. It was clear, Dinesh, after the opening statements by both the prosecution and defense, it would be impossible to explain to jurors the complexity of this case without bringing up all the numerous informants and undercover agents who were involved. So they took their first morning break, the first day of testimony, which was last Wednesday, came back. The defense said, we need to present our entrapment case. All 4 of the defense attorneys agreed, and the judge said, you're right, there's no way that we could put this off like I had originally planned to. And so he allowed the defense then to move forward with the entrapment case. And that has been the major focus of the first few days of testimony. And so that's why the COVID thing is a little sketchy, because it did not seem in the first few days of the trial, in my opinion, that it was going well for the government at all.
Now, your article, which goes into all this in some detail, is titled, it's a really good title, Stoned Crazy Talk, Not a Plan, say Whitmer defendants. And I take it what the defense is arguing here is that, look, we've got some wild and crazy guys, and they were saying some reckless and irresponsible things in online chatter and in communications to each other, but they were too big of losers to actually pull off any kind of plot. They didn't have the means, the know-how to do it, and that the FBI injected itself into the operation from the very beginning and sort of shepherded it to its conclusion step by step, and that without the FBI's involvement, this wouldn't in fact have even happened. Am I summarizing correctly the thrust of the defense argument?
You summarized it perfectly. I mean, this was basically online chatter, online Facebook video rants. But until this key informant, known as Dan, entered the picture in March of 2020, this random group of outcasts, really misfits, would never have gotten together but for Dan's involvement. And then another key informant, he goes by the name of Steve. Steve is a convicted felon with a rap sheet in 9 states, yet he's a longtime FBI informant who organized all of these trips. So he organized a militia conference where a few of the men attended. He got them all ginned up. This was 2 weeks after the George Floyd riots. He recorded what these men were saying in private. Of course, the whole country was up in arms about what was happening. Recorded that. He organized surveillance trips to Whitmer's cottage, which is way up north in Michigan, not easy to access. To your point, these defendants could not even pay for gas. The main leader is a guy named Adam Fox, actually a very sad story. 37-year-old man, basically unemployed, especially because of the lockdowns. He lived in a dilapidated cellar of a vacuum repair shop in a strip mall in Grand Rapids. If he had to use the bathroom or brush his teeth, Dinesh, his lawyer said last week, he had to go to the Mexican restaurant next door. You're telling me this guy, so down on his luck, no family, really no friends, concocted this multi-state operation with all these militiamen to go kidnap, possibly kill Gretchen Whitmer outside of her very remote vacation cottage in upstate Michigan? I mean, none of this makes sense. And the more that you're hearing about these agents and informants, the more Americans should be truly alarmed how this FBI operates, what they have been saying about how they handle their informants, their lax rules, paying them in cash, they reimburse them without receipts. I mean, this would never be allowed in any sort of American business, but this is how our top law enforcement agency is conducting its business, which I write about in my piece that you're talking about.
I mean, one of the key figures here, a guy that I think deserves a lot of scrutiny, is Stephen D'Antuono. This is a guy who was apparently the head of the FBI Detroit office. He supervised this seeming entrapment scheme, and then very interestingly was transferred to Washington, D.C., where he's kind of supervising the January 6th operations, which is to say that, and I think this is an implication very much in your article and in your book, that it could be that the Whitmer kidnapping was a dress rehearsal for the much bigger operation that we now know as January 6th.
I think it's hard to separate the two because the Whitmer kidnapping case also centered around a protest at the Lansing Capitol building in April of 2020, which looks a lot like a dress rehearsal for what happened on January 6th. What's interesting, Dinesh, and of course the timing of the Whitmer trial is terrible for the January 6th prosecution. All the speculation, even by some in Congress, about the use of hundreds of FBI undercover agents, informants, some sort of assets, and what happened before and during January 6th. Here's what's interesting. The government moved to conceal the true identities of two undercover FBI agents who were really central towards the end of the kidnapping scheme. They asked the judge not only to conceal their true identities, but to prevent the courtroom artist from sketching their faces and making that public. The argument by DOJ was that these two men are also involved in ongoing domestic terror investigations, which has to be January 6th, because this is the largest unprecedented domestic terror investigation in American history. The judge thankfully denied that motion. I expected those men to be testifying this week. This could be contributing to the alleged COVID delay. But why did they want to hide the identity of these undercover agents? Why did they try so hard to keep this away from the public? So once we see, if we do see who their identity and even their images, which was a really odd request, that may give us some more open doors into exactly what D'Antuono was doing. During the Whitmer kidnapping trial, oddly promoted to D.C. the week after the arrest in October 2020, and certainly the man in charge of the key FBI agency during the events of January 6, 2021.
Julie, let's take a pause. When we come back, I do want to pivot to January 6th and talk about a couple of new developments there.